Hey friends, tonight we're re-stepping back into one of the most turbulent chapters of modern history, when Britain and France faced the rising storm of Adolf Hitler. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these calm journeys through history truly bring you peace. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, relax your shoulders, and let's drift together into the uneasy calm before World War II. You can almost imagine it. The silence that followed the guns. After 4 years of thunder, mud, and grief, Europe in 1918 was no longer the same continent that had marched so confidently into the First World War. The fields of northern France were littered with reminders of what modern war could do. Towns that once held markets and laughter were little more than shells of stone and memory. And in Britain, the bells that rang for peace also rang for the lost, for the names that would never come home. The Great War had ended, yes. But peace was something else entirely. In the quiet years that followed, both Britain and France faced the impossible task of rebuilding not just their cities, but their sense of purpose. The old world had died somewhere in the trenches, and the new one, whatever it was, had yet to be born. In Paris, the cafes filled again, slowly at first. Veterans, many missing limbs or faces, sat beside poets and journalists. They spoke softly about la guerre, the war, as if saying its name too loudly might bring it back. France had lost nearly a generation of young men. 1 out of every 4 Frenchmen between the ages of 18 and 30 had died. Every village had its monument, its carved names, its wreaths of fading flowers. In Britain, life returned to the rhythm of rationing and rebuilding. The war had taken its toll on industry and families alike. Women who had worked in factories and hospitals during the fighting were expected to quietly return home, though many did not. The streets of London looked familiar, but something in the air had changed, a weariness that never fully lifted. And hanging over both nations was a question: what had it all been for? The politicians of the 1920s tried to answer that question with treaties and paperwork. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was meant to ensure that such a war could never happen again. Germany was to pay reparations, vast sums that no one quite knew how to calculate, and to accept the blame for the entire conflict. The French wanted security, the British wanted stability, and almost everyone wanted to believe the nightmare was over. For a time, that illusion held. The League of Nations was born out of idealism, a promise that diplomacy could replace bloodshed. It met in Geneva, where men in grey suits talked earnestly about disarmament and arbitration. In classrooms, children were taught that the League would keep peace forever. Yet even in those early years, cracks began to show. When Japan invaded Manchuria, the League protested, but nothing happened. When Italy eyed Abyssinia, the meetings continued, but no one acted. The world had found a way to condemn violence politely, while quietly preparing for the next one. For France, the interwar years were defined by fear, the fear of another invasion. Along the eastern border, workers and engineers began constructing what would become the Maginot Line, a vast network of concrete bunkers, artillery posts, and underground tunnels. It was a marvel of engineering, precise and heavily funded, but it was also a symbol of a nation preparing to defend itself the same way it had the last time. In Britain, the fear was different. There was less focus on fortifications and more on maintaining the empire, the trade routes, and the illusion of control. The British people were tired of war. Their politicians reflected that mood. There was a quiet belief that the continent's troubles could be managed, or, if not, at least contained by diplomacy. The phrase, "never again," became not a warning, but a hope whispered in parliament halls and dinner tables alike. Life, on the surface, seemed to return to normal. In London, jazz drifted out of cafes. In Paris, artists like Picasso and writers like Hemingway and Stein filled the streets with a sense of creative rebellion. The world called it les années folles, the crazy years. But beneath the music and laughter was a kind of exhaustion. The dancing, the painting, the endless conversation. They were distractions from the emptiness left by a lost generation. The 1920s also brought economic uncertainty. Inflation hit hard, especially in France and Germany. British coal miners went on strike. The Great Depression that began in 1929 rippled across the world, closing factories, emptying savings accounts, and eroding trust in governments. And yet, through all this, Britain and France clung to one idea: that peace could somehow survive neglect. You see, peace is not a natural state for nations. It has to be maintained, fed, and defended with effort. But the people of the 1930s were tired of effort. They wanted comfort, quiet, and the promise that someone else, anyone else, would make sure war didn't return. Politicians talked about disarmament conferences and collective security, but most citizens were more interested in unemployment benefits and bread prices. When Germany began to change under a new, loud, and theatrical leader, many in Britain and France shrugged. They had seen so many political movements rise and fall since 1918. Monarchists, socialists, fascists. It all seemed part of Europe's noisy recovery. Few people read Mein Kampf. Even fewer took it seriously. Hitler's speeches, when printed in newspapers, were often described as exaggerated or continental bluster. In the pubs of London and the cafes of Marseille, people talked about the weather, about cinema, about the latest dance craze, rarely about politics. There was a collective numbness, a fatigue that made the world's warnings seem distant and irrelevant. Still, there were small signs, quiet ones, that something was changing. German factories began humming again. New uniforms appeared. German diplomats began speaking with newfound confidence, and German newspapers grew louder in their complaints about the unfair Versailles settlement. France noticed, of course. Britain did too. But neither wanted to be the one to act. In French schools, children still practiced air raid drills, not because anyone expected another war soon, but because old habits die slowly. In Britain, the Ministry of Defence quietly studied the costs of rearmament, but concluded that voters would never approve it. Public opinion, one official wrote, is not yet prepared to finance another war. Ordinary people, if they thought about war at all, thought of it as something abstract, a thing that existed in history books or faraway colonies. Europe, they believed, was civilized now, rational, modern. But peace was fading in small, almost invisible ways. It wasn't the sudden kind of fading, like a candle blown out. It was slower, quieter, like paper yellowing with time. Borders hardened, rhetoric sharpened, and faith in international institutions thinned. By the mid-1930s, the air in Europe was heavier. Not yet fearful, but unsettled. It was in the headlines, yes, but also in small human moments. The rising price of bread, the growing queues at train stations, the whispered memories of men who had fought before. A British soldier who'd served at the Somme once told a journalist, "It won't happen again. No one's that foolish." The journalist wrote it down, printed it in the paper, and believed it too. France and Britain, still bound by their shared suffering from the last war, would soon be bound again by something else. The realization that the peace they had built was far more fragile than they ever imagined. The world was drifting toward a storm, slowly, reluctantly, as if in sleep. And so, as 1930 turned to 1931, and 1931 to 1932, the question began to form in quiet corners of both nations, not shouted in Parliament, not printed in headlines, but whispered in worry. If peace depends on hope alone, how long can it last? If you could travel back to Germany in the early 1920s, you might not recognize it. The air was thick with bitterness and uncertainty. The empire was gone. The Kaiser was gone. The pride of a once mighty nation had been stripped away by defeat, debt, and humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles hadn't just redrawn Germany's borders, it had redrawn its soul. Factories sat idle. Veterans wandered the streets, medals pinned to threadbare coats. Children went hungry as paper money became worthless. In 1923, a single loaf of bread could cost billions of marks. People carried wages home in baskets, then rushed to spend them before the prices rose again. Even the middle class, the great stabilizing force of any society, found itself reduced to survival. It was in this chaos that a small, angry voice began to find its audience. His name was Adolf Hitler, a failed artist, a soldier from the trenches, a man who had lived through the collapse and found in it not despair, but opportunity. He spoke to the wounded pride of his people, to their hunger for order, meaning, and someone to blame. In Munich beer halls, where smoke hung thick and tempers ran hot, he preached about betrayal, about renewal, about Germany's destiny. At first, few outside Germany paid attention. In London, the newspapers covered Hitler's early outbursts with mild curiosity, the way one might read about a local eccentric. France, still mourning its losses and clinging to its hard-won security, viewed him with contempt. A loud man in a broken country. The Western world, weary of war and fascinated by its own recovery, looked away. But within Germany, the National Socialist movement grew. It drew in veterans who felt forgotten, workers who feared communism, and citizens desperate for hope. By 1933, when Hitler was appointed Chancellor, the transformation was nearly complete. In Britain and France, there was confusion. How had this happened so quickly? Diplomats in Paris sent cautious reports. "Germany is restless," one wrote, "but perhaps order will bring stability." Others argued that strong leadership might actually prevent chaos, that Hitler's energy could be harnessed for peace. After all, no one wanted another civil war in Europe. There was a tendency, especially in London, to rationalize. Hitler, they said, was a nationalist. Yes, but so were many leaders. He had grievances, as all nations did. Perhaps, if treated with respect, he would act responsibly. Britain's Prime Minister at the time, Stanley Baldwin, once remarked privately that the German people will moderate him. It was a comforting thought, and completely wrong. Meanwhile, France watched warily but cautiously. The French army remained the largest in Europe, and the Maginot Line gave the illusion of security. Politicians promised that the nation's defences were impenetrable. Yet, behind the speeches, there was fear. France had lost too much in the last war to risk another. The people wanted peace above all, and their leaders knew it. Hitler's rise was not sudden thunder. It was a slow storm that most chose to ignore until it was already overhead. Each year brought new signs, small at first, then unmistakable. The first came in 1933, when Germany withdrew from the League of Nations. Officially, it was a protest against disarmament talks. Unofficially, it was a statement. Germany would no longer be bound by others. Britain's newspapers noted the event with mild concern. France's Foreign Minister, Joseph Paul Boncourt, expressed alarm but found little appetite for confrontation. Then came the Nuremberg laws, the censorship, the burning of books. Reports filtered out through journalists and travellers, describing the arrests of political opponents and the persecution of Jews. But to many outside Germany, it all seemed like distant noise. Unpleasant, yes, but not urgent. People in Britain spoke of internal German matters. In Paris cafes, intellectuals debated whether Hitler represented a temporary madness or the birth of something permanent. The truth was simpler. Europe had lost its reflex for danger. Throughout the mid-1930s, Hitler moved carefully, testing the patience of his neighbours. Each step was small enough to avoid war, yet bold enough to reveal ambition. Rearmament began quietly, in defiance of Versailles. Factories that once built cars began building tanks. Airfields expanded. Young men were called to serve again, not as soldiers yet, but as trainees. France protested. Britain hesitated. Both feared that confronting Germany might lead to exactly what they most wanted to avoid, another war. And so, they waited. Neville Chamberlain, who would later become Prime Minister, was still a rising politician then, but his worldview was already clear. He believed deeply in negotiation, in the power of reasonable men to settle unreasonable disputes. Peace through understanding, he called it. It was an idea born of decency and naivete. To the average citizen, meanwhile, Hitler was still little more than a headline. Life went on. In Britain, the 1930s brought cheap radios, suburban housing, and the hum of new technology. In France, the Popular Front government tried to modernize labor laws and increase leisure time. People read about the Nazis, but were more concerned with wages, cinema, and the occasional summer holiday. It is remarkable, in hindsight, how quietly history can shift. In 1935, Hitler announced the return of conscription, another open violation of the Versailles Treaty. Germany would build an air force, an army, and a navy once more. The League of Nations condemned it, of course, but condemnation was all it could offer. Britain sent notes. France called for talks. Nothing changed. For Hitler, each unpunished act confirmed what he already suspected. The world would not stop him. The remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 was the true test. It was, by the letter of the treaty, a direct challenge to France. German troops marched into a demilitarized zone, gambling everything on the assumption that no one would oppose them. Had France mobilized, the soldiers would have retreated. Hitler admitted as much later. But France did not move. The government debated, then hesitated. Britain advised calm. The German soldiers who entered the Rhineland carried orders to withdraw if fired upon. None were. For France, it was paralysis born of trauma. Memories of 1914 haunted every decision. The French High Command argued that without British support, confrontation would be too risky. And Britain, still clinging to hope that Germany could be reasoned with, quietly urged restraint. Diplomacy, they said, would solve it. But diplomacy only works when both sides want peace. By 1937, the rhythm of German expansion had become familiar. Each new violation brought a protest, a debate, a resignation, and then silence. Europe was learning to live with aggression. Chamberlain called it the price of peace. Even as warnings grew louder, ordinary people in Britain and France tried to believe in calm. The radio still played dance music. Theatres filled each night. Children went to school and learned about the Great War as if it were a chapter already closed. In Germany, the story was different. The nation pulsed with energy, terrifying, organized, purposeful. Factories ran day and night. Flags fluttered from rooftops. The promise of renewal had become a religion. Young men joined the Hitler Youth, learning loyalty before morality. The world had underestimated not just one man, but the machinery of conviction he was building. And yet, from a distance, it all seemed almost admirable. The efficiency, the discipline, the national pride. "He's rebuilding Germany," people would say in London, drawing rooms, and French cafes. "Perhaps this is good for Europe." That was how denial spoke, politely, with reason and restraint. But beneath the surface, a shadow was spreading. The rhetoric grew darker. The military parades louder. Neighbours in small German towns began to disappear quietly. The trains started to move at night. Britain and France, still haunted by memories of the trenches, watched from across the border and told themselves it would stop. That moderation would return. That no leader could truly want another world war. They were wrong. And as the 1930s drew to a close, one quiet truth began to settle in. The kind of truth that seeps slowly. The kind that no one wants to name aloud. They were running out of time. The year was 1936, and across Europe the idea of peace had become a kind of ritual, spoken often, believed rarely. Britain and France, still burdened by the memory of the last war, continued to speak the language of diplomacy, even as events began to outpace words. appeasement. It was a polite word, a word that sounded reasonable, almost noble. To appease meant to calm, to ease tensions, to make peace where there might otherwise be conflict. It was a word that belonged to drawing rooms and parliament halls, to the voices of men who still believed that reason could outthink fear. And in 1936 and 1937, appeasement seemed to work, at least on paper. Germany had reoccupied the Rhineland, yes, but no shots had been fired. The League of Nations had wavered, but war had not returned. In London, that counted as progress. In Paris, it counted as survival. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who took office in 1937, embodied this cautious hope. He was methodical, reserved, and genuinely believed that most conflicts arose from misunderstanding rather than malice. Chamberlain thought of himself as a peacemaker in the old Victorian sense, a man who could settle disputes through calm discussion and compromise. And yet, while Chamberlain measured words, Hitler measured borders. In 1938, the German gaze turned south to Austria. It was, in Hitler's mind, a homecoming. The Anschluss, or union, between Germany and Austria had been forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. But treaties, Hitler believed, were relics for weaker men. On the morning of March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the border into Austria. There was no resistance. Crowds cheered. The union was declared. France issued a protest. Britain called it an internal German matter. The League of Nations once again said little and did less, and for the third time in 5 years, Hitler learned that the West would not stop him. In London, the newspapers printed images of smiling Austrians waving flags, and many readers found it hard to object. "They seem happy enough," one headline remarked. For most Britons, Austria was a faraway place of mountains and opera houses, not something worth another war. In Paris, the reaction was more anxious, but even there, the appetite for confrontation was gone. France was divided politically, paralyzed by domestic strikes and economic struggles. The Popular Front government faced its own crisis of confidence. French generals warned that their army was not ready, their morale uncertain, their alliances weak. So, France looked to Britain for leadership, and Britain in turn looked to diplomacy. Then came Czechoslovakia. It was a young country, carved from the wreckage of empires after the Great War, democratic, prosperous, and proud. But within its borders lived 3 million ethnic Germans, concentrated in the mountainous Sudetenland. They had lived there for centuries, but now Hitler claimed they were oppressed. The world had heard this kind of claim before. It was the language of justification, the prelude to action. As tensions grew, Czechoslovakia looked to its allies, France and Britain, for help. France had a treaty promising defense. Britain had moral influence. Both nations had doubts. In the summer of 1938, the situation began to spiral. Hitler demanded self-determination for the Sudeten Germans. The Czech government refused. Across Europe, people began to whisper the word war again, not loudly, but with the kind of quiet dread that spreads like fog. Chamberlain, deeply unsettled by the thought, made an extraordinary decision. He would go to Germany himself. The first visit took place in September 1938. The British Prime Minister, then nearly 70, flew to Munich, the first time he had ever flown in an airplane, to meet the German Chancellor face to face. The two men spoke privately for hours. Chamberlain believed, or perhaps needed to believe, that he was dealing with a man who could still be reasoned with. When he returned to London, he was greeted with applause. Newspapers called him courageous, statesmanlike, even visionary. "Chamberlain flies for peace," read the headlines. Ordinary Britons sent him letters of gratitude. Mothers wrote that he had saved their sons from another war. In the small towns of England and France, relief was almost tangible. But the relief was short-lived. Hitler's demands grew. He wanted not just autonomy for the Sudetenland, but full annexation. He wanted it immediately. Europe held its breath. The British cabinet was divided. Some argued for a firm stance, others urged caution. Chamberlain, convinced that war would destroy civilization itself, pressed on for compromise. He arranged one final conference in Munich to settle the matter once and for all. On September 29, 1938, 4 men met in a room: Adolf Hitler, Neville Chamberlain, French Premier Édouard Daladier, and Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Czechoslovakia was not invited. Neither was the Soviet Union. The discussions were brief. Hitler got what he wanted, the Sudetenland, in exchange for a promise of peace. It was the ultimate act of appeasement. The belief that giving a man what he demands will satisfy him, rather than feed his hunger. When Chamberlain returned to Britain the next day, he stepped off the plane holding a piece of paper signed by Hitler. "Peace for our time," he declared. The crowd cheered. Bells rang. For one brief evening, it felt as if the world had been spared. But not everyone was convinced. Winston Churchill, then a political outcast, stood in Parliament and spoke with quiet fury. "You were given the choice between war and dishonor," he said. "You chose dishonor, and you will have war." His words were dismissed as pessimism. People wanted to believe in peace. The idea of another war was too painful to contemplate. In homes across Britain and France, families folded their newspapers and went to bed comforted. And in Germany, Hitler smiled. Within months, the truth became clear. In March 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. There was no pretense of ethnic unification now, no excuse of protecting German minorities. It was open conquest. The Munich Agreement was worthless, and Chamberlain knew it. He felt betrayed, but perhaps more than that, he felt foolish. The strategy of appeasement had not prevented war, it had only postponed it. And with each delay, Germany had grown stronger. The reaction in France was equally grim. The French press, long divided between fear and fatalism, finally began to accept that Hitler's ambitions knew no bounds. Yet, even then, hesitation lingered. Could Europe still negotiate its way back to safety? Could another conference buy just a little more time? Time, that was the quiet currency of appeasement. Every compromise bought a few more weeks, a few more months of peace. For leaders who had lived through the slaughter of the trenches, that time felt precious. But time, as it turned out, was not neutral. It was working for the other side. In the spring of 1939, Hitler turned his attention eastward. Poland was next. Britain and France, at last, made a stand, at least in words. They guaranteed Poland's independence. If Germany invaded, they would go to war. It was a line drawn late, but finally drawn. Still, the mood across both nations was not one of confidence. In the streets of Paris and London, people began to quietly prepare. Gas masks were distributed. Air raid shelters were dug. Children practiced evacuation drills. The newspapers still printed hopeful editorials, but underneath the headlines, there was an unspoken awareness the storm could not be delayed forever. And as the summer of 1939 drew near, a subtle tension began to hum through Europe, like the quiet vibration before a train arrives. The illusion of peace had done its job. It had lulled a continent to sleep, convinced that words could hold back history. But history, as always, was patient. It waited for the moment when belief would finally collapse under the weight of reality. Appeasement had failed, not because the men who pursued it were weak, but because they were tired. They had seen too much of death to imagine it returning, and so they mistook denial for wisdom. In the end, all their efforts came down to one bitter truth. Peace cannot be kept by hoping the storm will change its mind. And in that quiet summer of 1939, as diplomats traded telegrams and leaders clung to promises that were already broken, the question that no one wanted to ask began to echo in the minds of millions. When the storm finally comes, will anyone be ready to face it? By early 1939, the uneasy calm that had followed the Munich Agreement began to unravel. Europe, for a brief few months, had hoped that Hitler's appetite for conquest had been satisfied. After all, he had been granted the Sudetenland, the border region of Czechoslovakia where many ethnic Germans lived, under the promise that it would be his last demand. The leaders of Britain and France had returned home, claiming peace had been secured. Yet, beneath the surface, that peace was already beginning to decay. In Prague, there was little illusion about what had truly occurred. The once proud nation of Czechoslovakia had been dissected. The Sudetenland, its mountain defences, and much of its heavy industry were now under German control. What remained was a fragile core: the plains of Bohemia, the rolling lands of Moravia, and the rugged mountains of Slovakia, all dependent on the goodwill of a dictator who had shown little interest in promises. The Czech people, pragmatic and quietly resilient, carried on with a sense of subdued defiance. In the factories of Skoda, men continued to shape steel and craft machinery. Farmers tended to their winter fields. Schoolchildren recited lessons under the dull light of March mornings. Life continued, as it often does, even as the ground beneath it trembled. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler's attention turned fully to Prague. To him, Czechoslovakia was unfinished business. The German army had learned a great deal from its partial occupation of the Sudetenland. The importance of swift movement, psychological warfare, and the quiet power of intimidation. Now Hitler sought to test those lessons in full. In March 1939, the final blow came with chilling precision. First, Slovakia was encouraged to break away. German agents whispered promises of independence, of a Slovak nation free from Prague's influence. Josef Tiso, a Catholic priest turned politician, was brought to Berlin and assured that his people would be protected under German guidance, so long as they declared independence. The pressure was immense, and on March 14th, Slovakia proclaimed itself a separate state. The following morning, German troops crossed the border into the Czech lands. They met no resistance. The Czech army, stripped of its defences and abandoned by its supposed allies, was ordered not to fight. President Emil Hácha, an elderly lawyer and reluctant leader, had been summoned to Berlin the night before. What happened in that meeting remains one of the most unsettling episodes in European diplomacy. Hácha was made to wait until well past midnight before being ushered into Hitler's office. The Führer, intense and unyielding, delivered an ultimatum. German troops were already moving toward Prague. Resistance would mean destruction. Compliance would ensure peace. Hácha, exhausted and terrified, collapsed in the meeting. He was revived by a doctor, and shortly after, he signed the document surrendering his country to Germany. At dawn on March 15th, German tanks rolled into Prague. Snow flurries drifted through the air as soldiers in grey uniforms marched across the Charles Bridge. Citizens watched in silence, some crying quietly, others staring blankly, as if unable to process what had happened. The ancient city, with its spires and cobbled streets, fell without a shot. By the afternoon, the Nazi flag flew over Prague Castle. Czechoslovakia, a democratic experiment born from the ashes of the First World War, ceased to exist. In London and Paris, the reaction was one of shock and shame. For months, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had defended the Munich Agreement as the price of peace. But this latest act revealed the hollowness of Hitler's assurances. He had promised no further expansion, and within 6 months, he had swallowed a nation whole. For the French, it was another humiliation layered atop a decade of indecision. Their great ally in Central Europe, now gone, had been a cornerstone of France's defensive strategy. The French army still clung to its mighty Maginot Line, that vast stretch of concrete and steel along the German border, but its political will to act was brittle. Britain, too, found itself at a crossroads. The public mood was shifting. For years, many had believed that avoiding another war was worth almost any price. But as Hitler's ambitions became undeniable, that faith began to fracture. In Parliament, voices grew louder, Winston Churchill among them, warning that appeasement had only strengthened the enemy. Still, both nations hesitated. There were discussions of guarantees and alliances, of promises to protect Poland and Romania. but they were words without weight. No troops were moved, no new defenses built. Europe watched quietly as Hitler's empire expanded in every direction. And yet, for all its tragedy, the fall of Czechoslovakia revealed something more profound about the times. It showed how power, once unchallenged, feeds upon itself. It showed how nations, bound by fear of another war, could drift into moral paralysis. And it showed how ordinary people, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, could wake one morning to find their world rewritten without a single shot fired. In Prague, life resumed under occupation. German administrators replaced Czech officials. Street names were changed. Factories began producing for the Reich. The everyday details of control, ration cards, curfews, new currencies, took hold with quiet efficiency. The Czech people adjusted, not out of loyalty, but out of survival. And across Europe, a question lingered, unanswered. If Hitler could take Czechoslovakia without resistance, what would stop him next time? Perhaps it was Poland, perhaps something farther still. But the truth was simpler, and far more unsettling. Nothing yet had stopped him at all. By the spring of 1939, Europe was waking from its uneasy dream of peace. The occupation of Prague had torn away the last illusions about Hitler's intentions. There would be no final settlement, no lasting compromise, no boundary he would respect. The leaders of Britain and France, so long content to believe that diplomacy could restrain him, were now forced to confront the truth they had tried to ignore. War was coming, but even as they faced that reality, both nations were unprepared. Britain's army was small, its air force still expanding, its navy stretched thin across a global empire. France had the largest standing army in Western Europe, but it was cautious, slow-moving, and defensive in spirit, built for holding lines, not seizing initiative. And so, in the weeks following Hitler's triumph in Prague, the Allied government scrambled not to fight, but to make a statement. That statement came in the form of a promise, vague in substance, but bold in intent. On March 31st, 1939, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain stood before the House of Commons and announced what would become known as the Polish Guarantee. He declared that Britain, with France's full support, would come to the aid of Poland if its independence were threatened. It was, on paper, a firm line in the sand. In reality, it was drawn with trembling hands. Few in London believed Britain could actually defend Poland. The two countries were separated by Germany itself, and Britain had no troops stationed on the continent beyond small detachments. But the guarantee was not about geography. It was about principle. It was meant to signal that the era of appeasement had ended, that Hitler could no longer act without consequence. In Warsaw, the news was received with mixed emotions. The Polish government, led by Marshal Edward Ritz-Śmigły and Foreign Minister Józef Beck, had watched the collapse of Czechoslovakia with alarm. They knew they were next in line. For months, Berlin had been pressuring Poland to join the Axis, to surrender the free city of Danzig and allow German control of a highway through the Polish corridor, linking Germany with East Prussia. Hitler framed it as a reasonable request. The Poles saw it as a slow strangulation of their sovereignty. When they refused, the threats began. So Britain's guarantee came as both comfort and burden. Comfort, because it meant Poland was no longer alone. Burden, because it made them a front line in what was clearly becoming a continental struggle. Still, for a few brief weeks, there was hope, faint but real, that the line might hold. In Paris, the French government followed Britain's lead, reaffirming its own pledge to defend Poland. French generals dusted off old alliance documents, drawing plans that were more symbolic than strategic. The Maginot Line remained their anchor, an immense wall of steel, concrete, and underground tunnels stretching hundreds of miles along the German border. They believed it could buy them time to mobilize. But in Berlin, Hitler barely paused. He was furious, certainly. The guarantee was an open act of defiance, but also emboldened. The reaction of Britain and France confirmed what he already believed. that his enemies would talk, not act. They would issue statements, not send soldiers. In his mind, they were nations still haunted by the trenches of the last war, too scarred to fight again. Through April and May, Germany intensified its preparations for an invasion of Poland. The Wehrmacht mobilized divisions, and propaganda filled the German press with tales of mistreated ethnic Germans in Danzig. Hitler presented himself as their protector, just as he had with the Sudeten Germans months before. The pattern was identical, the justification familiar. Meanwhile, in Britain, the government struggled to project calm while quietly racing to rearm. Airfields were expanded, anti-aircraft batteries erected, and factories converted to produce war materials. Yet all of it felt painfully late. In small English towns, people began to dig air raid shelters in their gardens. Children practiced putting on gas masks at school. Newspapers published diagrams of how to black out windows at night. The memory of the First World War hung like a ghost. And now, another war loomed on the horizon. Still, Chamberlain clung to a faint hope of reason. In his heart, he was not a man built for war. He continued to send letters and envoys, urging negotiation. He believed, perhaps desperately, that Hitler could still be deterred by firmness combined with diplomacy. But the German dictator was not listening. In late April, Hitler publicly renounced the German-Polish Non-Aggression Pact of 1934. It was his final break with the facade of peace. In his speech before the Reichstag, he accused Poland of aggression, Britain of encirclement, and France of hypocrisy. The crowd roared in approval. The line had been drawn, but to Hitler it was invisible. As summer deepened, Europe drifted once again into tension. Diplomatic cables crossed the continent daily. The British sought alliances with the Soviet Union, believing that perhaps Stalin's regime could help contain Germany. The talks were slow, full of suspicion. In Moscow, Soviet negotiators watched the Western powers closely, uncertain whether they truly intended to act. And in Poland, the soldiers waited. They trained in open fields, their horses grazing nearby, their rifles polished to a dull shine. They knew their equipment was outdated. Their tanks were few, their planes older than Germany's newest models. But there was a sense of grim pride. They had fought before, in 1919, when Poland was reborn from empire's ruins. They would fight again. Ordinary life continued. Markets opened, trains ran, the summer air carried the smell of ripening grain. Yet beneath it all, there was that strange quietness that always comes before the storm. A feeling that everything, the sound of a church bell, the laughter of a child, the rustle of wind through fields, might soon belong to a vanished world. Britain and France had finally drawn their line. They had made their promise. But history rarely bends for promises, and as August approached, events would unfold that neither London nor Paris could stop. For in a few short weeks, Hitler would strike a deal with a man as ruthless as himself, one that would divide Europe, betray Poland, and set the world on fire. The summer of 1939 unfolded under a strange, heavy stillness. Across Europe, diplomats shuttled between capitals, carrying messages of reassurance and warnings of impending catastrophe. In London, Paris, Berlin, and Moscow, cables hummed, telephones rang late into the night, and the air seemed to thicken with rumours. War felt certain, but the exact shape it would take remained a mystery. At the heart of that mystery stood two men, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, whose mutual hatred seemed to make any cooperation impossible. One had built his ideology on destroying Bolshevism, the other on resisting fascism. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the Soviet Union as the mortal enemy of civilization. Yet, as the summer grew hotter, the unimaginable began to happen. Germany and the Soviet Union, two regimes born from blood and revolution, began to talk. It started quietly. Through intermediaries, signals were sent. Hitler, preparing his invasion of Poland, knew he could not risk war on two fronts. The nightmare of 1914 still haunted German strategists. Fighting both France and Russia had once destroyed the empire. If he struck eastward toward Poland, he needed Stalin's neutrality. In Moscow, Stalin watched the European powers with cold detachment. For years, he had been urging Britain and France to form a united front against Hitler. Yet when the moment came, their negotiations had been hesitant, almost reluctant. Western envoys arrived in Moscow without real authority to make binding commitments. Stalin, ever suspicious, concluded that the capitalist nations secretly hoped Germany and the Soviet Union would destroy each other, leaving them to pick up the pieces afterward. And so, he made his choice. If the West would not treat him as an equal partner, he would deal with Hitler instead. Not out of trust, but out of calculation. The proposal took shape quickly. On August 19, 1939, Hitler sent his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, to Moscow. Stalin, ever the realist, received him with surprising warmth. Beneath the chandeliers of the Kremlin, two ideologues who despised each other, worlds, sat across a polished table and began to carve up the continent. The document they signed on the night of August 23, 1939, would become one of the most infamous treaties in modern history, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, it was presented as a simple non-aggression treaty, an agreement that Germany and the Soviet Union would not attack each other. The announcement stunned the world. To most observers, it seemed as if up had become down. The two great enemies of ideology were now allies of convenience. But the real substance of the pact lay hidden in its secret protocol, a separate agreement kept from public view, outlining how Hitler and Stalin would divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be split down the middle, the western half falling under German control, the eastern half claimed by the Soviet Union. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and later Lithuania, were assigned to Moscow's sphere of influence. Finland was also marked for Soviet attention. Romania's province of Bessarabia was quietly added to the list. In essence, the map of Eastern Europe was redrawn in a single night, not through war but through ink and calculation. When the news reached London, there was disbelief. British intelligence had suspected German-Soviet talks, but few thought Stalin would sign such a pact. For years, the West had viewed the Soviet Union as the potential bulwark against Nazi expansion. Now, that illusion shattered. In Berlin, Hitler was elated. The pact cleared the path to Poland. No longer fearing a two-front war, he ordered his generals to finalize plans for invasion. He told them it was time to act, swiftly, decisively, before Britain or France could recover their nerve. In Moscow, Stalin was satisfied but cautious. He understood Hitler's nature well enough to know this peace would not last, but it would buy time. Time to rebuild the Red Army, still weakened by his own purges. Time to strengthen fortifications along the western border. Time to watch the capitalist powers exhaust each other in another world war. And so, both dictators believed they had outwitted the other. In truth, they had simply postponed the inevitable clash. As August drew to its end, the world began to tilt. In Berlin, soldiers were briefed in hushed rooms. Trains carrying armored divisions rolled toward the Polish border under cover of night. Pilots memorized flight routes. In Warsaw, the government knew an attack was coming. Intelligence reports were clear. Yet the scale of the assault and the sudden isolation caught them unprepared. The British and French guarantees still stood, but their distance from Poland made any real defense impossible. On the evening of August 25th, Hitler momentarily hesitated. A last-minute rumor spread through the Reich Chancellery that Britain and Poland had finalized their alliance that very day. He delayed the invasion for 48 hours, considering whether he had miscalculated. But the decision had already been set in motion. In the early hours of September 1st, 1939, without warning, German troops crossed the Polish border. It was the moment the world had been dreading for 20 years, the collapse of the fragile peace built after the Great War. At 4:45 a.m., German artillery opened fire near the town of Westerplatte, and the battleship Schleswig-Holstein began bombarding the Polish garrison. Within hours, Luftwaffe planes darkened the sky, diving upon cities and railway lines, turning the morning sun red with flame and dust. Europe had entered a new kind of war. Fast, relentless, mechanized. The world would soon learn the meaning of a new word. Blitzkrieg. In Moscow, Stalin remained silent. His armies stayed still, awaiting their turn. For now, he would watch as Hitler consumed the west of Poland. The Pact of Shadows, as history would later remember it, had done its work. Two men, distrustful yet aligned, had divided a continent and unleashed a storm that neither would be able to control. And as the guns roared in Poland, ordinary Europeans, farmers, mothers, children, clerks, looked east and west and realized that the peace they had hoped for was gone. Gone, perhaps, forever. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, the stillness of the Polish countryside was broken by the rumble of engines. From the forests, from the skies, from every direction, the German army surged forward. The invasion of Poland had begun, the first strike of a war that would soon engulf the entire world. In those first hours, confusion and disbelief spread faster than news itself. Many in Poland had clung to the hope that Hitler was bluffing, that the tension of August would somehow dissolve into another uneasy truce. But when German planes appeared overhead, dropping bombs upon railway yards, bridges and cities, the truth became undeniable. The war had arrived. The assault was unlike anything Europe had seen before. In the last war, armies had advanced slowly, inch by inch through mud and trenches. Now, the Germans moved with terrifying speed. Their strategy, later known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was built on coordination, momentum, and shock. Tanks rolled across open fields, smashing through weak points in the Polish defences. Dive bombers, the dreaded Stukas, screamed down upon roads and villages, spreading panic as their sirens howled. It was not a war of attrition. It was a war of movement, precise, mechanized, and ruthless. For Poland, resistance was immediate but uneven. The Polish army was brave and determined, but ill-equipped. Many divisions were still mobilizing when the invasion began. Communication lines broke down under bombardment. Some units fought desperately to hold their ground. Others were cut off within hours. In the north, the German army advanced from East Prussia. In the west, they poured in from Silesia and Pomerania. And in the south, they attacked from Slovakia. Within days, Poland was being crushed from 3 directions. Yet even amid the chaos, stories of defiance emerged. At Westerplatte, a small Polish garrison of fewer than 200 men held out against the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein for 7 days. Their courage became a symbol of national pride. In the skies, Polish pilots, flying outdated planes, managed to shoot down dozens of German aircraft in the opening week. And in the city of Warsaw, citizens dug trenches in the streets, prepared barricades, and took up whatever weapons they could find. The Germans advanced relentlessly, but the Poles refused to surrender easily. In London and Paris, the long-feared question finally demanded an answer. Britain and France had pledged to defend Poland. Now, their promise was being tested. On September 3rd, 1939, 2 days after the invasion began, the British ambassador in Berlin delivered an ultimatum. If German forces did not withdraw from Poland, Britain would declare war. The deadline passed unanswered. At 11:15 a.m., Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's voice came across British radio. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. France declared war a few hours later, and so, quietly, without celebration, World War II began. But in Poland, the promised help from the West did not arrive. The French army mobilized slowly, advancing only a few miles into Germany before halting at the Siegfried Line. The British Expeditionary Force was still assembling and would not reach France for weeks. For the Poles, the guarantees of march had turned into distant words carried on the wind. They fought alone. By mid-September, the Polish defences had crumbled under the relentless German assault. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, destroying bridges, cutting rail lines, isolating entire divisions. Refugees filled the roads, columns of carts and bicycles carrying families, their few belongings piled high, moving eastward in search of safety. But safety was about to vanish there as well. On September 17th, from the east, Soviet forces crossed the border. The Red Army advanced swiftly, claiming to protect eastern Poland after its government had supposedly collapsed. In truth, it was the secret clause of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact being fulfilled. Poland was to be divided between its two powerful neighbours, as if it were nothing more than a line on a map. The Polish government, realising the hopelessness of the situation, fled south into Romania. Warsaw held out for another week, bombed day and night until entire districts lay in ruins. On September 27th, the city surrendered. In just 4 weeks, Poland had been conquered. The world was stunned by the speed of Germany's victory. Military observers noted the terrifying efficiency of the Blitzkrieg. The coordination between tanks, infantry, and air power had created a form of warfare that made old defences meaningless. Trenches and fortresses, once symbols of strength, now looked obsolete. For the people of Poland, the defeat marked the beginning of a dark and brutal occupation. Germany annexed the western half of the country, incorporating it into the Reich. The remaining territory, known as the General Government, was placed under Nazi control, a place for forced labour, mass arrests, and executions. In the east, the Soviet Union imposed its own rule, deporting thousands to Siberia, imprisoning officers, and erasing the symbols of the Polish state. Yet, beneath the occupation, resistance began to stir. Small underground networks formed almost immediately. Teachers, priests, former soldiers, and students working in secret to preserve their nation's spirit. They printed newspapers, carried messages, and smuggled information to the West. It was the beginning of one of the most remarkable resistance movements of the war. Meanwhile, in the West, Britain and France entered what became known as the Phony War. Though officially at war, little happened along the front. Soldiers manned the trenches of the Maginot Line, waiting for an attack that never came. In the cities, blackout curtains were hung each night, gas masks were issued, and civilians practiced air raid drills. The world held its breath. Poland had fallen, but the larger storm had only begun. Hitler turned his attention westward, toward the Low Countries and France. His generals were already drafting new plans. And far away, in the quiet offices of London and Paris, men studied maps and asked themselves a grim question. If Poland could fall in 4 weeks, how long could they survive when their turn came? After the thunder of September 1939, Europe fell into an eerie silence. The war had begun, yet nothing seemed to happen. From the coast of the North Sea to the mountains of Switzerland, the Western Front remained still, a frozen line of bunkers, barbed wire, and soldiers waiting for orders that never came. Newspapers in Britain called it the Phony War. In France, they named it La Drôle de Guerre, the Strange War. It was as if the continent had paused between breaths. For the soldiers, this strange quiet was both a relief and a torment. In northern France, along the Maginot Line, hundreds of thousands of French troops manned vast underground fortresses. Deep beneath the earth, they slept in bunk beds, ate in canteens, and listened to the hum of generators. The Maginot Line was an engineering marvel. Miles of tunnels, heavy steel doors, and gun turrets that could rise silently from the ground like mechanical beasts. It was meant to protect France from another German invasion. But now, as winter set in, it became something else entirely, a world of waiting. Men played cards, wrote letters home, and watched frost creep along the concrete walls. Radios played softly in the background, carrying news from Paris and the BBC. Each day passed much like the last. The soldiers' enemies were boredom, dampness, and the creeping sense that they were being outweighted. Across the border, German troops stood in their own positions, facing the French through forests and valleys. They too waited, but with purpose. Behind them, the German war machine was rebuilding, rearming, and planning. The factories of the Ruhr worked day and night. Trainloads of ammunition, tanks, and fuel moved quietly through the countryside. While France and Britain remained static, Germany prepared to strike again. In Britain, the sense of unreality was even stronger. After the initial shock of declaring war, life seemed to return to an odd kind of normal. Shops reopened, trains ran, children went to school wearing gas masks slung over their shoulders. Yet the fear lingered beneath the surface, the constant awareness that something terrible was coming. Cities enforced blackout orders. At night, every window was covered with heavy curtains or painted dark blue to prevent light from escaping. Wardens patrolled the streets shouting, "Lights out," at any careless glow. The air was heavy with anticipation and the faint smell of damp sandbags. People waited for the bombing raids that never came. In London, families carried gas masks wherever they went. Mothers pushed prams with compartments for infants to breathe filtered air. Underground stations were reinforced to serve as shelters. In the countryside, children evacuated from the cities wrote letters home. "Dear Mum, I am safe and the cows are very big." For all its quiet, the war had already reshaped ordinary life. And yet, there was humour too, that stubborn human tendency to find normality even in crisis. Cafes served tea by candlelight. Newspapers published crossword puzzles beside grim headlines. In pubs, soldiers joked that the only things under fire were the cooks and the cold weather. Still, beneath the surface calm, the strategic situation was shifting in ways most civilians could not see. In Berlin, Hitler was already looking north and west. Poland had been crushed with startling speed. Now he wanted to control the North Sea and the resources of Scandinavia. His generals drafted plans for invading Denmark and Norway, seeking access to Swedish iron ore that travelled through the Norwegian port of Narvik. That iron was vital to German weapons production. Without it, the Reich's war machine would slow. Meanwhile, in France and Britain, military leaders debated endlessly. Some wanted to strike first, to help Finland in its new conflict with the Soviet Union. Others argued for caution, fearing that any movement would provoke Germany. Every plan seemed to dissolve into hesitation. The result was paralysis. From September 1939 to April 1940, the Western Allies dropped only leaflets over Germany, not bombs. Millions of papers fluttered down on German towns, filled with messages urging civilians to overthrow Hitler or question the war. The Germans nicknamed them Lügenzettel, lies on paper. For the British and French soldiers on the front, the months dragged on endlessly. They built snowmen, listened to football matches on crackling radios, and wrote home about the monotony of it all. "We are at war," one British private wrote in his diary, "but it feels more like an endless autumn camp." In Paris, cafes buzzed with a strange mixture of fear and optimism. Many believed that the Maginot Line and Britain's navy would keep them safe. After all, the German frontier seemed quiet. The memory of 1914 still haunted the older generation, but this new war, so calm, so distant, seemed almost manageable. Yet, deep inside the German high command, the next campaign was already taking shape. A plan that would make the world's strongest armies look obsolete. In the frozen winter of 1939-40, while the West waited, Hitler's generals studied the maps of Belgium and the Ardennes forest. They saw something others had missed, a narrow forested corridor that France believed impassable for tanks. In that assumption lay France's greatest vulnerability and Germany's opportunity. But before striking at France, Hitler would make his move in the north. As January 1940 faded into February, Allied intelligence intercepted whispers of a German build-up near the Baltic. The invasion of Norway was coming, though no one yet knew when. The war that had felt so distant was about to awaken. The quiet months of waiting were nearly over, and somewhere along the darkened coastlines, soldiers on both sides began to sense it, that the silence would not last much longer. It was only the calm before another storm. By the spring of 1940, the stillness that had settled over Europe began to tremble. For months, The war had been more of an idea than a reality, a waiting game in which soldiers watched clouds drift over trenches and governments drafted speeches instead of strategies. But now, far to the north, Hitler's plans were about to snap the silence. The new campaign began not with declarations or ultimatums, but with the quiet movement of ships in the dark. In the early hours of April 9, 1940, German warships slipped through the cold waters of the Kattegat, the narrow sea between Denmark and Sweden. Their mission: to secure the northern flank of Europe before Britain or France could react. The operation was called Weserübung, Exercise Weser. Its targets were Denmark and Norway, two countries that had tried desperately to remain neutral. Germany's reasons were practical, almost mundane. Precisely the kind of dull details that often decide wars. The port of Narvik in northern Norway was vital. Through it flowed shipments of Swedish iron ore, which Germany relied on to produce weapons and machinery. In winter, when the Baltic Sea froze, Narvik was the only route still open. If Britain controlled it, Germany's entire armament industry would suffer. To Hitler, this was unacceptable, and so, before dawn, German forces moved with precision and speed. Denmark was first. It took less than 6 hours. German troops crossed the border at 4:15 a.m., supported by paratroopers and planes. Copenhagen awoke to the distant hum of engines and the sight of low-flying bombers over the city. Within hours, the Danish government realized the futility of resistance. Their small army, barely 30,000 strong, was no match for the Wehrmacht. King Christian X made a quiet, heartbreaking decision: to surrender and avoid needless bloodshed. By noon, Denmark was under German control. No major battles were fought. No cities were destroyed. The war there ended almost before it began. But Norway was different. The Norwegian coast stretched for more than 1,500 miles, twisting through fjords and icy mountains. To control it, Germany would need to take multiple ports simultaneously: Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, Narvik, and others. The operation was a logistical nightmare, and yet somehow they pulled it off. German destroyers and cruisers entered Norwegian harbours just before sunrise. Paratroopers dropped near key airfields. In Oslo, the government was caught off guard, and the king, Håkon VII, fled north with his ministers rather than surrender. German officers presented the government with a demand: accept protection under Germany's guidance. The Norwegians refused. Resistance was swift, improvised, and surprisingly fierce. Norwegian soldiers, often poorly armed, fought back in mountain passes and villages buried under snow. In Narvik, a port city surrounded by icy peaks, local troops, helped by British, French, and Polish units, held out against the invaders. For a brief moment, the Allies seemed to have an advantage. In late April, British warships entered the fjords and clashed with German naval forces. The cold air echoed with gunfire and explosions. Ships burned on the water, and snow turned grey with ash. British troops landed at several points along the coast, establishing beachheads to support Norway. For the first time since the war began, the Allies were on the offensive, but their plans were disorganized. Coordination between Britain and France was weak, supplies arrived late, and communication broke down in the harsh terrain. The German response, however, was swift and ruthless. Luftwaffe bombers swept over the Norwegian skies, attacking ports and Allied ships with relentless precision. In Oslo, German troops advanced steadily northward. In Trondheim, resistance was crushed after days of brutal fighting. By early May, the situation was becoming desperate. Narvik, though still contested, was surrounded. Allied troops were exhausted, ill-prepared for the cold, and constantly bombed from above. And then came the shocking news: Germany had invaded the Low Countries and France. The entire focus of the war shifted overnight. Britain and France could no longer afford to keep their forces tied up in Norway. The real storm, the one everyone had been waiting for, had begun in the west. Reluctantly, the Allies ordered an evacuation. By early June, the last British and French troops withdrew from Narvik, and within days, German forces took control of the city. King Håkon VII refused to surrender. He escaped to Britain aboard a Royal Navy ship, taking with him the Norwegian government in exile. From London, he continued to broadcast messages of defiance to his people, reminding them that occupation was not defeat. In Norway, German troops settled into a long occupation. The puppet government of Vidkun Quisling, whose name would later become synonymous with treachery, was installed in Oslo. Life under German rule began with small adjustments: ration cards, curfews, propaganda leaflets, and the quiet disappearance of dissenters. It was the same pattern that would soon repeat itself across Europe. To many outside observers, the fall of Denmark and Norway seemed like a minor episode, two small nations caught between great powers. But to historians, the campaign revealed something more profound. It showed that Germany's new form of warfare, swift, coordinated, mechanized, and backed by air power, was unlike anything Europe had seen before. It was a rehearsal for something much larger. In London, the news of Norway's fall was grim. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain faced growing criticism in Parliament. Members of his own party turned against him, frustrated by the government's lack of energy and direction. One speech in particular, by a man who had been warning about Hitler for years, changed everything. His name was Winston Churchill. In a calm but thunderous voice, Churchill declared that Britain could not afford further hesitation. He reminded Parliament that the war was not merely about borders or treaties, but about survival itself. Within days, Chamberlain resigned. On May 10, 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. It was the same day Germany invaded France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The fall of Norway had closed one chapter of the war, but opened the next. And as Europe's northern skies cleared of smoke, a new front was bursting into flames. On the morning of May 10, 1940, Europe awoke to the roar of engines. It was the sound that Britain and France had feared since the war began, the moment when Hitler-S armies finally struck west. For months, Allied leaders had expected a repeat of 1914, another slow push through Belgium, another grinding stalemate. What they did not expect was how quickly everything would collapse. That morning, as dawn broke over the Low Countries, German bombers filled the sky. They swept over Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, striking airfields, railway lines, and bridges. Paratroopers, a new and terrifying weapon, dropped from the clouds in waves, seizing key positions before defenders could react. The campaign that followed would later be called the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. It was fast, precise, and devastatingly effective. Tanks, infantry, and aircraft moved together as one machine, overwhelming enemy positions with speed rather than numbers. In the Netherlands, the invasion began at sunrise. German paratroopers landed near The Hague, Rotterdam, and key river crossings. Dutch soldiers fought bravely, often with outdated weapons, but their courage could not match the coordination of the German attack. 4 days later, on May 14th, German bombers unleashed terror on the city of Rotterdam. In less than 15 minutes, much of the city centre was destroyed. Flames rose high into the sky, and nearly 900 civilians were killed. The horror of the bombing broke the Dutch resistance. The next day, the Netherlands surrendered. In Belgium, the story was similar, though with more complexity and courage. Belgium had built a powerful defensive fortress at Eben-Emael, guarding key bridges over the Meuse River. The fort was considered impregnable. Its walls were concrete, its guns massive, and its position dominating. But early on May 10th, a small group of German paratroopers landed silently on the roof using gliders. They carried special explosives that could pierce concrete. Within hours, they had captured the fort that was meant to stop an army. The path into Belgium was open. Meanwhile, the main German forces launched their assault through the Ardennes forest, a region of hills and dense trees that Allied planners had thought impassable for tanks. That assumption proved fatal. The Germans moved through the Ardennes with astonishing speed. Armoured divisions rumbled down narrow roads, guided by motorcyclists and engineers who cleared obstacles ahead. Local villagers watched in silence as an endless column of machinery wound through the misty valleys. By May 13th, German tanks reached the Meuse River near Sedan and crossed it. French defences, caught off guard, were overwhelmed in hours. The once mighty French army, thought to be the strongest in Europe, was now facing collapse. The Allies, following their old plan from the First World War, had sent their best divisions north into Belgium to meet what they believed was the main German attack. But that was exactly what Hitler intended. The northern push through Belgium was a distraction. The real strike, the sickle cut, came through the Ardennes, splitting the Allied forces in two. Within days, the German army had reached the English Channel. It was an almost unbelievable feat of speed and coordination. By May 20th, German tanks stood on the coast near Abbeville, having crossed the entire width of France in just 10 days. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and large parts of the French army were now trapped in northern France, cut off from the rest of their forces. In London, news of the disaster arrived in fragments: confused reports from the front, broken communications, desperate pleas for reinforcements. Winston Churchill, newly appointed as Prime Minister, spent sleepless nights in the war room beneath Whitehall, studying maps, chain-smoking cigars, and muttering, "How did it come to this?" In Paris, the mood was one of disbelief. The French government had trusted in the Maginot Line, believing it would hold. But the German army had simply gone around it. French officers, trained for slow, deliberate warfare, were unprepared for the speed and flexibility of the Blitzkrieg. The roads of northern France became scenes of chaos. Refugees, families pushing carts, bicycles, and even wheelbarrows filled the highways, trying to flee the fighting. Cows wandered loose through the fields. Abandoned cars littered the roadside. Above them, German planes swooped low, strafing the columns. The sound of engines became a constant presence, the hum of a new kind of war. By late May, the situation for the Allies was desperate. The British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian troops, was surrounded near the coastal city of Dunkirk. There seemed to be no way out. But before that desperate evacuation began, one more tragic chapter would unfold: the surrender of Belgium. King Leopold III, faced with the total collapse of his army and the suffering of his people, decided to lay down arms on May 28th. He did so without consulting his Allied commanders, a move that shocked and angered both Churchill and the French. For the Belgians, it was the only possible choice. For the Allies, it felt like betrayal. The German advance now pressed toward the sea, tightening the noose around the trapped armies. At Dunkirk, the sound of artillery grew louder each day, and yet, even in the shadow of defeat, small miracles were beginning to take shape. Acts of courage and improvisation that would soon turn one of history's greatest disasters into an astonishing rescue. As May turned to June, German tanks stood poised outside Dunkirk. The beaches were filling with exhausted men, and Britain, an island nation watching from across the Channel, was about to make a decision that would define its spirit for generations. By the final days of May 1940, the war that Britain and France had hoped to keep at a distance had come crashing to their very doorstep. In the north of France, the beaches near Dunkirk, a quiet port city surrounded by dunes and fishing villages, became the last refuge of a trapped army. Nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers, British, French, and Belgian, were pinned between the advancing German forces and the cold grey waters of the English Channel. Behind them lay destruction. Before them, the sea. It was, by every military standard, a hopeless situation. The German army had cut through France with terrifying speed. Their tanks, the panzers, had already reached the coast, slicing through Allied lines and isolating the British Expeditionary Force. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, now ruled the skies, and every road leading west was choked with refugees and burning vehicles. In London, Winston Churchill faced the unthinkable, the possible loss of Britain's entire professional army. Without it, the nation would stand defenseless. And yet, in this dark moment, something remarkable began to happen. The evacuation plan was codenamed Operation Dynamo, after the dynamo room in the Admiralty's underground headquarters where it was conceived. The idea was simple in theory, but almost impossible in practice, to rescue as many soldiers as possible from the beaches of Dunkirk and bring them across the Channel to England. The Royal Navy prepared its ships, destroyers, minesweepers, hospital ships, anything that could float. But soon, it became clear that the Navy alone could not reach all the stranded men. The beaches were too shallow for large vessels to approach. Soldiers would have to wade out into the surf, chest deep under constant fire. And so, a call went out, one that would define British courage in its quietest form. Every available boat was needed. Fishing trawlers, river barges, pleasure yachts, ferries, even small sailboats. Civilian volunteers, ordinary men and women, answered without hesitation. They became known as the Little Ships of Dunkirk. They came from every corner of Britain, from Ramsgate, Dover, Margate, and beyond, their decks piled with fuel cans, blankets, and determination. Some were crewed by Navy reservists, others by fathers and sons who had never seen combat. They crossed the Channel under the constant threat of air attack, moving through smoke and wreckage, guided by little more than courage and a compass. On May 26, 1940, the first soldiers began boarding ships from the East Mole, a long, narrow breakwater that stretched out into the sea. It was not meant for such use, yet it became the lifeline of the evacuation. All around, Dunkirk burned. The town had been bombed repeatedly. Oil tanks exploded near the docks, filling the air with black smoke that blotted out the sun. The beaches were crowded with men standing in long, silent lines, rifles slung over their shoulders, helmets gleaming faintly in the haze. They waited patiently, sometimes for days, while German planes screamed overhead. The Luftwaffe attacked relentlessly. Bombs fell across the beaches and piers, tearing through sand and surf. Ships were sunk before they could load a single passenger. Yet the men held their places, moving forward inch by inch. Those who made it aboard spoke of the calm, the eerie discipline of men who had accepted their fate but refused to despair. From the cliffs of Dover, observers could see the faint glow of Dunkirk burning across the water. Churchill watched the reports come in. A few thousand rescued the first day, then tens of thousands more. Among the rescuers were countless unsung heroes. A tugboat captain who made 7 crossings without rest, a teenage sailor who pulled drowning soldiers from the sea, a schoolteacher from Kent who ferried men aboard his family's holiday yacht. They were not soldiers, yet their bravery changed the course of the war. The sea itself seemed to offer its help. For 9 crucial days, the English Channel remained unusually calm. German ground forces paused, a mysterious halt order from Hitler himself, possibly out of overconfidence or concern for overextended supply lines. That brief pause gave the Allies the time they needed. By June 4th, the evacuation came to an end. A total of 338,000 men had been brought safely to Britain. Nearly a third of them were French soldiers, who would later continue the fight from abroad. The losses were enormous. Hundreds of ships sunk, countless men killed or captured. Yet somehow, the story did not feel like defeat. It felt like survival. When Churchill addressed the nation that week, his words carried the quiet gravity of a people who understood both the miracle and the cost. He reminded Britain that wars are not won by evacuations, but he also called the rescue a deliverance, a miracle of deliverance. The soldiers who arrived home were greeted not as survivors, but as heroes. Exhausted, unshaven, and dazed, they stepped onto English soil to find crowds waiting, women handing out tea, children waving flags, dockworkers cheering through tears. They had come back from the edge of annihilation. But Churchill knew what was coming next. France was still collapsing, Germany was preparing its final blow, and the island of Britain, now standing alone, would soon face the full fury of the Nazi war machine. As the last ship left Dunkirk, carrying the final handful of soldiers away from the flames, the sound of distant thunder followed them across the Channel. It was not yet over. The storm that had swallowed Europe was turning toward the sea. When the last Allied ships slipped away from Dunkirk's smoke-filled horizon, the war in France was not yet over, but its outcome was already written in the weary faces of those left behind. In the days that followed the evacuation, France stood battered, divided, and almost defenseless. The once proud French army, the same army that had held its ground for 4 long years in the First World War, was now exhausted and broken. The Maginot Line, that great symbol of French security, still stood intact in places, but it no longer mattered. The Germans had simply gone around it. In early June 1940, as the beaches at Dunkirk emptied, the German army turned south. Columns of tanks, trucks, and motorcycles thundered through the French countryside. The wheat fields of Picardy rippled beneath their treads. Villages that had been untouched for centuries were suddenly filled with soldiers shouting in a foreign tongue. For the French people, the war had arrived at their doorstep. Refugees fled south in endless streams. Farmers pushing carts, mothers carrying infants, old men walking beside donkeys loaded with pots and blankets. Trains overflowed with passengers. Roads became impassable. Planes circled above, their shadows gliding over the long lines of people below. Many would later remember the sound. The distant hum of engines that never seemed to stop. In Paris, the government struggled to maintain control. Ministers argued bitterly about whether to continue fighting or to seek an armistice. Some believed France could still regroup in the south. Others saw surrender as the only way to spare the country further ruin. In the midst of this turmoil, one man refused to give in. His name was Charles de Gaulle, a relatively unknown general at the time. He had commanded an armoured division during the fighting and had seen firsthand the power of modern mechanized warfare. To him, France's defeat was not inevitable. It was the result of hesitation and outdated thinking. De Gaulle called for continued resistance, urging that France's colonies in North Africa could serve as a base for rebuilding. His words were bold, but they came too late. The government, now based in Bordeaux, had already begun negotiations with Germany. Meanwhile, in Britain, Winston Churchill pleaded with the French leadership to hold on just a little longer, to retreat across the Mediterranean if necessary, to keep the fight alive. But France, drained of will and strength, was already slipping away. On June 10th, Italy declared war on France, striking from the south in what many saw as an opportunistic move. The Italian advance achieved little, but it added another wound to an already dying nation. 4 days later, on June 14th, German forces entered Paris. The city had been declared an open city, meaning no resistance, no fighting, no destruction. French troops had withdrawn and the government had fled. When the German army arrived, they found a city silent and still. Witnesses described an almost dreamlike scene. German soldiers marching down the Champs-Élysées, their boots echoing on the cobblestones. The Eiffel Tower, draped in haze, untouched. Civilians watching from behind half-closed shutters. Some cried quietly. Others stood in stunned silence. Paris, the heart of Europe's culture and beauty, had fallen without a single shot fired in its defense. The shock reverberated across the world. In London, Churchill received the news in grim silence. "The ancient glory of France," he said softly, "has perished." But in his heart, he refused to believe it was permanent. "France has lost a battle," he would later say, quoting de Gaulle's own words. But France has not lost the war. On June 17th, Marshal Philippe Pétain, the aging hero of Verdun, took over as head of the French government. His message to the nation was weary and final. "It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today we must stop fighting." The next day, France requested an armistice. Hitler, determined to humiliate his old enemy, chose a symbolic location for the signing, the same railway carriage at Compiègne, where Germany had surrendered to France in 1918. He had the carriage removed from a museum, placed in the same clearing, and sat in the same chair once occupied by the French commander. When the French delegation entered, the silence was suffocating. Hitler spoke briefly, then left the rest to his officers. Within minutes, the terms were read. Germany would occupy the northern and western parts of France, including Paris. The south would remain nominally independent under a new government based in the spa town of Vichy. The armistice of June 22, 1940, marked not just the fall of France, but the end of an era. Europe's balance of power, centuries in the making, had collapsed in just 6 weeks. The French army, once the pride of the continent, was gone. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped, but barely, and Germany now controlled nearly all of Western Europe. For many, it felt as though civilization itself was crumbling, and yet, in small corners of defiance, sparks remained. From exile in London, Charles de Gaulle delivered a radio address to the French people on June 18th, urging them not to lose hope. "Whatever happens," he said, "the flame of French resistance must not be extinguished and will not be extinguished." In the occupied zones, some listened secretly to those words through crackling radios, hearts heavy but alive. In the Vichy-controlled south, others clung to the illusion of peace. But everyone knew the shadow of occupation had fallen, and its weight would linger for years. Back in Britain, Churchill watched the map of Europe darken. The fall of France meant that Britain now stood alone. The last line between Hitler and total domination of the continent was the narrow strip of sea separating England from the mainland, the English Channel. And across that water, the German war machine was already turning its gaze toward the island nation that refused to yield. The fall of France was not the end of the war. It was the end of illusions. The end of the old Europe that had believed war could be avoided, that peace could be negotiated. The next chapter would be fought in the skies above Britain. And for the first time in this long, unfolding nightmare, the world would watch as a nation stood alone against the storm. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Europe was unrecognizable. The grand cities that had once symbolized civilization's progress, Warsaw, Berlin, Rotterdam, London, lay in ruins. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Railways twisted like broken threads. Whole neighborhoods were flattened to dust. The war that had begun with the invasion of Poland 6 years earlier had consumed everything in its path. Tens of millions were dead. Entire generations had been uprooted, scattered, or lost. And though victory had been achieved, it did not feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. The people of Europe emerged from the wreckage slowly, blinking in disbelief at what remained. The air still carried the scent of smoke and ash. Streets were lined with the shells of buildings, jagged windows staring out like the eyes of ghosts. Yet amid the rubble, life began again. In Britain, the mood was somber but determined. The island that had once stood alone against Hitler's onslaught now faced a new challenge: rebuilding from the inside out. Bombed-out cities like London, Coventry, and Liverpool began the slow work of reconstruction. Families who had spent years in air raid shelters returned to streets they no longer recognized. There was rationing, shortages, and long queues for bread and coal. But there was also something new, a shared understanding that the old world could not simply return. In 1945, the British people voted for a different kind of victory, not on the battlefield, but in society itself. They elected a government that promised to rebuild a land fit for heroes. From this, the National Health Service was born, along with sweeping reforms in housing, education, and welfare. Britain's war had forged a quiet revolution, one rooted not in empire or pride, but in compassion and endurance. Across the Channel, France faced a different reckoning. The memories of defeat, occupation, and collaboration ran deep. Cities like Caen, Le Havre, and Saint-Lô were reduced to stone and dust. Paris had survived the war largely intact, but beneath its beauty lay scars of betrayal, both personal and political. The liberation of France in 1944 had brought euphoria, but also questions. Who had resisted, and who had submitted? Who had survived by compromise, and who had died for honor? In the years that followed, France sought to heal by rebuilding, not only its cities, but its soul. Charles de Gaulle returned, this time as a national leader, determined to restore French dignity. Under his guidance, France began to modernize, rebuilding industry, infrastructure, and a sense of purpose. But the deeper rebuilding, the kind that happens inside hearts and memories, took longer. For many Europeans, the war had shattered their faith in nations, ideologies, and even humanity itself. How could such destruction come from the same civilization that had given the world art, music, and philosophy? And yet, amid the ruins, something remarkable began to grow. Former enemies began to talk. France and Germany, whose rivalry had fueled centuries of conflict, now sought cooperation. Britain, too, looked across the Channel, not as conqueror or savior, but as partner. From these fragile beginnings came the first steps toward what would one day become the European Union, a vision born not from victory, but from shared ruin. The idea was simple, almost painfully so. If nations built together, they might never again destroy together. For ordinary citizens, the work of healing was quieter still. Farmers returned to fields littered with shrapnel. Children played among the broken stones of churches. Mothers planted flowers in the cracks of bombed-out streets. Slowly, the sound of hammers replaced the sound of gunfire. The rhythm of rebuilding, measured, patient, and human, became the new music of Europe. Writers, artists, and philosophers tried to make sense of it all. Some searched for meaning in the ashes. Others found it in resilience. There was no single story of recovery, only countless small ones. Of families reunited, of love rediscovered, of lives rebuilt from fragments. And as the years passed, the memories of alliance and betrayal that had once divided Britain and France began to change shape. They became lessons, painful, necessary, and enduring. Both nations had faced their darkest hours side by side. They had stumbled, argued, and sometimes failed each other. But in the end, they had survived together. And perhaps that was what mattered most. The old Europe, of rival empires and uneasy peace, was gone. In its place rose a quieter world, cautious but hopeful, built not on power, but on shared endurance. The war had begun with nations chasing glory. It ended with people searching simply for belonging. And in that long silence that followed the last explosion, something profound was learned. That standing together is less about victory and more about survival. That perhaps in the end, history's greatest triumphs are not the ones written in battles, but the ones whispered in the ruins, when people choose to rebuild, not because they must, but because they still believe in each other. And that is where we'll leave our story tonight. A Europe once torn apart, slowly learning to breathe again. Nations that had faced each other across trenches and bombed streets, now meeting across tables and rebuilding brick by brick, memory by memory. It's strange to think, isn't it, that history's loudest moments often fade into the quiet work of ordinary people. The men and women who carried stones, who shared what little food they had, who tried, in small, unrecorded ways, to make the world gentle again. If you've made it this far, you've just spent an hour traveling through one of the most complex stories in modern history. And yet, in the end, it always seems to come back to something simple: the will to survive, the courage to rebuild, and the hope that tomorrow might be kinder than today. So take a deep breath. Let the noise of the past fade away now. All the armies, all the speeches, all the headlines, just echoes in time. What remains is the quiet, the steady rhythm of rebuilding, the patience of people who never stopped believing that peace, however fragile, was worth the effort. Thank you for spending part of your night here, drifting through the soft corners of history with me. If these calm journeys through the past help you find rest, consider subscribing. But only if it feels right for you. There are so many more nights ahead, so many forgotten stories waiting to be told softly, without hurry. Now, close your eyes. Let the sounds of history fade into the stillness of the present. And wherever you are, I hope tonight you rest easy, knowing that even in the ruins, humanity always finds a way to rebuild. Good night.